what we're talking about today is Exodus chapter 2. We just learned last time that the government of the world, which was Egypt, had established laws that were contrary to God's law. I mean, it sounds a lot like what's going on in the world today. In fact, what they were trying to do is through pharmakia, which was this health message of taking the life of children, like, partial birth abortions. They were doing there where they were saying if it's a male or if it's a female, you're going to kill one and keep the other alive. This whole pharmakia ideology of trying to preserve life or at least dwindle down the population of that day in Egypt, not that day, but that time in Egypt, is similar to what we're seeing today. The draconian measures in the world are coming forth, trying to do what they can to control population, control the pharmakia ideologies of the world. They're trying to establish laws that are contrary to the religious laws that God would have for us. And so we saw last time what it's like in Egypt and what it is like today in this world and how they can join together. So that's where we're coming from. We've just prayed together, and we're going to see what it is that the Bible is teaching here. In Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, there went out a man of the house of Levi. Now, Levi are the ones that stood up for God. You can see later in this chapter, they are the ones that are going to say, you know what, there's a line in the sand, we're on this side, you guys are on that side, and they were actually asked to perform judgment as a result of their stand because they were faithful and the others weren't. And so this is a good line from whence this man comes from. He's just called a man, and he came from the house of Levi. And he took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So they're from the same background, the same family, the same kind of bloodline, if you will. It says, verse 2, and the woman conceived. So she was pregnant, and she was about to have this son. Well, she did bear a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, and that word goodly means in the widest sense, just good. It's beautiful, better than the other children. I mean, like, what parent wouldn't say my child isn't better than the other children, right? Bountiful, cheerful, at ease, fair, favored, glad. What kind of parent wouldn't want a child like that, right? Wait a minute, on welfare? No, never mind. So what we have is this good child has come forth from her womb, and she hid him 3 months. So this woman is hiding her child for as long as she can. But when she could hide this child no longer, because, think about it. You have the cell phones that are listening to you, and you have potential ears in even your outlets. You have the internet who's listening to you, and the smart devices that are listening and watching you, right? You can't really hide from people. You can't hide for too long. Even today, and just as it was back then, she couldn't hide for more than 3 months. I mean, the child was starting to get noticed by the eyes, if you will, kind of like Big Brother. He's watching you. And so you have this whole scenario where she's trying to raise up this child for God, but she can't do it because the eyes of the nation are watching behind the the various tools that they have. Egypt is not referred to as a as a lion or a bear or a leopard, but you can kind of see some of the similar activities. Like a lion, for example, will use not just one, but several workers to come around in such a way that people can be surrounded. And then as there are, or not people, but the prey can be surrounded. And like in Babylon, being a leopard or a lion, the same thing. And so you have this surrounded prey, and many times the lion can roar, scare somebody out of a thicket of brush, and that animal will run right into the mouths of those female lions that are waiting there. Same thing with a cheetah. You don't even know that the cheetah is there. You don't know that it's coming. But what you do find out is that you're paralyzed because it's jumped on the back of your neck and you're face down in the dust, but you can't go anywhere. Well, that's kind of like what happens as well with Babylon. Well, kind of the same thing here with Egypt. You can see that a bear is very powerful and can just come in and destroy. So the lion, the bear, the leopard, all that stuff in Babylon is kind of similar to what we're seeing here in Egypt. They're strong, they're stealthy, they're creative and able to, capture their prey in such a way that you might be surprised. Well, what's happening is this woman doesn't know what to do with this child, and so the story continues where when she could not hide him any longer, she took for him an ark of bulrushes. So you know there were 2 arks in the Bible. One was for Moses and one was for Noah. Sometime if you wanted to ask some young person and say, hey, how many people were in the ark of Moses along with the animals? They'd be like, there was 8. You'd be like, no, actually that's not true. And, you know, the ark of Moses didn't even have animals. You could just use that as a conversation starter for young people. Sometimes it's helpful. So when she could not hide him any longer, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and she daubed it with slime and with pitch. And that was, of course, to make it waterproof, because she had a plan in her mind. She put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river brink. Now, what are these flags? I'm going to triple click that, and it's the papyrus. So it's like flags or near the Red Sea. It's the weeds that they have there in Egypt. And they are tall and actually, I think, fairly good looking. She laid it in these papyrus or flags by the river's brink. Now, I mean, what kind of mother is that? You have taken your child, raised it for 3 months, and now you're putting it out in the river so that, what, the alligators or crocodiles could come and eat it? Are you serious? The mosquitoes are going to come and land on your poor child? I mean, that doesn't sound like a good mother at all, right? But you don't have an option. Either this child is going to be taken and killed, or this child is going to be used as a slave or some other, reason. So she prayed, God, please help me. And I fully believe that angels were sent to guide this woman on how to take care of her child. And so what she did is right here, she laid it in the papyrus on the river's brink. And the family was so involved that the sister stood afar off to know what should be done to him. So the sister was very curious. She didn't want her little baby brother to be eaten by a crocodile, or to be consumed by the mosquitoes, or to be taken off in some way that would be contrary to her wishes. So she's there watching. And in this next paragraph, the story thickens. The daughter of Pharaoh, Pharaoh being like Egypt, he's kind of like a bear, lion, and leopard. And the daughter of this leader, which, kind of is like the daughter of the harlot, if you will, because you have this daughter in the picture. Well, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. Now, of course, this isn't the river of the water of life. This is the river of Egypt. And so you're not going to get as clean as you would hope in this religious scenario. But in the physical way, sure, you can get clean, but it's not going to clean your soul. Well, she came down and she washed herself in the river, and her maidens, the woman has daughters, if you will, or like workers with her. So in this case, the woman doesn't have daughters, but she does have maidens. So it's kind of like, the similar situation. Anyways, she's walking along the river's side, and when she saw the ark among the flags or papyrus, she sent her maid to fetch it. Now, wait a minute. She sent her maid. I've seen this in a number of the kingdoms of the earth. The king doesn't go out and do the service himself. He sends his servants. He sends his captain of the guard. He sends those that are messengers for him. You can see it all through the Old Testament, and you can see it in the New as well. Well, it's the same way here in Egypt. The Pharaoh's daughter, she's royalty. She doesn't go and get it herself. She sends her maid to fetch it for her. And in the same way in the kingdom of heaven, you have the father who uses his son. But his son is a prince, so the prince uses the angels. And the angels ascend and descend upon the ladder, and they do the service for the father and the son. There's royalty, there's leadership, there's service that is involved, and we are part of the kingdom of God, whereby we are being used by the Father and his Son in co-working with the holy angels. And so in this woman sending out her maid, it brings to my mind the bigger picture of how God is using people in his service as well. Anyway, she sends out this maid, and she goes to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child. And by the way, this is a begotten child, so it certainly could represent Jesus Christ as the only begotten Son of the Father, although we do know that this child is not the only begotten of his father and mother, as we saw that the sister was there on the river's brink, which would be Miriam, actually. It doesn't mention her name here, but that's who it is. When she opened it, she saw the child, and the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, wait a minute, this is one of the Hebrews' children. You could probably see from the skin color differentiation, the Hebrews were probably different coloration than what you see with these Egyptians. And so then said his sister to Pharaoh, who was right there nearby, and you can imagine the providence of all of this working out. The mother put the baby in the water at this point where the child was watching close enough to be able to see not only the child, but also Pharaoh's daughter who has come to wash. And she runs off in the perfect time from where she was hiding and comes over to where Pharaoh's daughter is. Shall I go and call thee a nurse? Now, not just any nurse, but a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? You can imagine like the Pharaoh's daughter's thinking, okay, I know who this child is, and I know who she's going to get. Well, you can't just get any woman to nurse a child, a babe of 3 months. What you need is a woman who has been able to recently give birth whereby she can have milk within her breasts, right? Because you can't just feed a child like, stuff from the Nile River. It just doesn't work that way. So these children were needing to be fed by a woman who was ready to nurse. And so I'm sure that this Pharaoh's daughter just knew exactly what was going on. So with a twinkle in her eye, what did she say? Then his sister came to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for the Hebrew woman that she may nurse the child for thee? And the Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, go. And the maid went, not, some random place. She went straight home and called the child's mother, which was actually her mother as well. And so this maid called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me. You are prepared, you can nurse it, because this is probably your child, I get it. And I will give you your wages. And the woman, blown away by God's providence, took the child and nursed it. Can you imagine how amazing that would be? In the midst of a time where the nations around you are telling you that you are going to lose your job if you don't follow the dictates of the will and the conscience of the state, whereby you need to go contrary to God's law or else you can't work anymore. You're not part of our team. Like you need to kill children or else you can't work for Egypt. And so like in the midst of that situation where you might lose your job because the nations are saying that if you don't get something, you won't be able to keep your job, right? So in the midst of that, there was this child that was raised. This woman didn't know what to do. She didn't want the child to be thrown into the river, right? Or killed. And so she took that child and hid him. And so she didn't want this child to be jabbed with mosquitoes, right? So this child was hid in such a way that perhaps she didn't have to follow the dictates of the state or the country or the county or the province that you're in. And so she's praying for that child. And one of her family, one that believes the same, she's over there trying to protect that child with prayers and having this ever-watching eye upon that child. And so in the providence of God, somebody from the wrong place, somebody from the state or country of Egypt, one of the leaders actually came. Like Kamala Harris. Can you imagine if she was like, no, never mind. So what you have here is that Pharaoh's daughter is actually coming in and she's the one that's delivering this child. Amazing. How would that be? I have no idea. God is amazing in his providence. And this woman here, the mother of Moses, is just mind blown, thunderstruck for how she has just seen God prepare for her child. Well, it's because God has a plan for that child. And I would say that God has a plan for your child as well. Don't think that God has anybody that he doesn't have a plan for. It's really the willingness of the parents and the willingness of the child that matters. Well, here you have this woman was willing. The sister, the older sister, was willing. And you can know that what you have in this story is somebody who is following the direction of God, even without even knowing it. So Pharaoh's daughter was in the midst of this, paying wages to a Hebrew woman, not heathen. So a heathen woman was paying wages to a Hebrew woman who was part of God's plan, which was contrary to Papa's wishes. You see how that works? This is amazing to me. Well, the child grew. And she, after 12 years, you can learn that in the Patriarchs and Prophets, after 12 years, she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. Oh, what a terrible time that would be. and he became her son. Can you imagine what that would be like? I mean, you have raised this child watching God's providence take care of him through Pharaoh's daughter, okay? So like the one that's supposed to be on the opposite side of the team, or the fence, if you will. The mother has just watched this child grow, and she has seen, even with every month, if you will, almost like socialism, wait a minute, being paid by the state? No, that can't be it. So you have this nation is paying for this child to be raised up, but it's part of God's plan, because God has already raised up this child in such a way that he's being nurtured and taken care of and fed and provided for by the state. This is kind of weird, isn't it? But it's part of God's plan, because he has people that even in the midst of this whole thing are unwilling to yield to the dictates of the state. You see how that works? And so Romans 13 comes into play. And if the nation, by the way, I did a presentation on Romans 13. I think it came out pretty well. So if you wanted to watch it, you could, and learn a little bit about how God's people can relate with nations if the nation is asking them to go contrary to God's will. So that's what's happening here. And so the mother of Moses has gone contrary to God, how would you say, the heathen nation, and God is protecting them and actually using them to pay her to raise up this child that he has for his purpose. Astounding. Anyways, you have this whole situation, and mother now is, after 12 years of raising this child, having to give over her son into the hands of an apostate nation. Wow. I don't know what that would be like. I've never done it. I have never even had to come close to it. I mean, okay, maybe, because I realized that just recently my son was given some mail from the government that said, hey, you need to sign up with us because there might be a need to use young men to go to some place called maybe like Afghanistan or something. That's a heavy thing for me. Like I told my son the other day with nearly tears in my eyes. So I guess I have been close to this situation. I said, man, I tell you, I do not want you to go, and I would much rather go for you than have you go in your own stead. And that's a real thing. I'd rather go. If somebody needs to go, I'd rather do it instead of my son. So, really, I guess I've been partly, at least ideologically in this scenario, though it's not a real situation yet. But I get it. The mother didn't want to give her son to the nation, okay? After 12 years of raising this child, she loved this child. This child was precious. She homeschooled this child. This child was one that was, dedicated to God from the very outset of coming into this world. And she didn't want to give this child over to the Egyptians. No. But this was part of God's plan as well. The child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and said, it was because I drew him out of the water. Now Moses, it actually means rescued or drawn out. Okay, so that's why it says she called his name Moses, and then she stated why. It was because that's what the name means. Well, the next paragraph. It came to pass in those days when Moses was grown up, he went out unto his brethren. He was now about 40 years old. He went out unto his brethren, and he looked on their burdens. Very similar to what happens in chapter 3, where God looks on the burdens of the children of Israel. Well, he did it a different way than God wanted it done. He spied an Egyptian that was smiting a Hebrew. And that was kind of like what the mother was afraid of, is the Egyptians would treat her son, which was Moses in this situation, contrary to her wishes. Well, the Egyptians are doing that. They're actually treating the Hebrews poorly. But it was one of the brethren of Moses. And so Moses was, kind of a little prejudiced with like, hey, wait a minute, that's my people. You're messing with my people. And so in verse 12, he looked this way and that way. And when he saw there was no man that could see him, at least he didn't think there was, he slew the Egyptian. You see, when you're in Egypt and you think you're not being seen, oh, you are. People see you. You'll find out that the very next day, Moses was learning quickly that, yep, you were seen. So even in this Egyptian nation, it's kind of like, it's leopard-like. You don't know that you're being seen. You can look to your left and you can look to your right, and you don't know that anybody's out there, but high up in a tree or hiding behind the grass down below you, there's a leopard watching you that you can't see. And it knows exactly where you are. And pretty soon it's going to pounce, and you won't even hear it until it gets you in the back of the neck. And that's kind of what's happening with Babylon. That's kind of happening with Egypt. And you've got the whole like family of God scenario and the nation that's trying to go contrary to God's law. Do you see how it fits in? This is all end time scenario. Egypt is amazing. When you put it into the Babylonian perspective, you realize like, wait a minute, this is a story that we're reading about in the book of Revelation, although Egypt is hardly mentioned. It is mentioned in Revelation 11, but it's like hardly mentioned otherwise. But you have the same characteristics that you see in Egypt as what you see in Babylon. And that's where we can put ourselves into this scenario and realize like, wow, this tells a story of us at the end of time. But it's like way back in history. This is Egyptian history, right? I didn't know that I fit into there. Well, sure you do. Look around. The world is starting to become Egyptian. The world is becoming Babylonian. And there is the family of God that are trying to raise up children for his kingdom. But it's really hard. You might lose your job if you're following the orders of God instead of the dictates of the nation. You might lose your job and you won't know how to keep your child from being jabbed from those mosquitoes in the river, right? So you can understand that this is real close to home, this whole Egyptian scenario. Anyways, he looked this way and he looked that way, and when he saw there was no man that he could see that was watching him, he slew the Egyptian, which is not what we're supposed to do. God didn't call Moses to slay Egyptians. He called him to raise his people up in their morals and bring them up out of Egypt. And he hid him in the sand. Okay, so that was like premeditated murder, if you will. At least he hid his evidence. It says there in verse 13, when he went out the second day, behold, there were two men of the Hebrews striving together, and he said to him that did the wrong, why are you smiting your fellow? Like, this is my brother, like it's your brother. Why are you infighting? The one true God movement is fighting each other. Why are you doing that? And they said, well, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Christ is our judge. You're not Jesus. What's your problem? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? And Moses now knew that he was not hiding alone. When it says he looked this way and that way, and when he saw there was no man, he slew the Egyptian. He realized that he had been seen. And so this question was raised. Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And Moses feared. Why did he fear? Because judgment was coming. Well, judgment was coming against him through the medium of Egypt. But you could also say that Moses feared God and gave glory to him. So you almost kind of see like the first angel's message there. He said, surely this thing is known. Now wait a minute, if Moses can't get past the all-seeing eye of Egypt, how are we thinking we're going to get past the all-seeing eye of God? You know, we actually went through 20 presentations. I just counted them yesterday. 20 presentations on the three angels' message. And one of them in the first angel's message, I think it's E, part 1E, I think it is. It's talking about being judged. Oh, I'm telling you, you can see from the Bible, from the very beginning all the way to the end, we are judged by our works. No matter what we do in this world, even if we think we can look to the left and to the right and we're not seen by anybody, we know that we will be judged according to our works because God sees. God is the one who takes record, you know, with his own eye, possibly, but for sure with the angelic ministry. And that's for sure what he's doing. He's revealed that to us, that he is taking record of all of our actions through the ministration of holy angels. And they're called recording angels. If you're interested to look that up, I've got notes on it. You can just ask me for it. And so what we can find is that God is doing everything to watch and record what we're doing for him and also against him. And so Egypt was watching Moses to see if what he was doing for him or against him. So the hour of his judgment had come, right? He is afraid because the hour of judgment was right about to come. And that's why it says here that Moses feared Egypt because surely this thing was known and judgment was about to come. So you have God's people fearing God because the hour of his judgment has come. So you have this similar scenario there. Look at verse 15. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. So there it is, the hour of his judgment had come. So now we have the nation coming out against God's people. Now, what is God going to do? Is he going to sit back and watch? Oh no, if God's people are faithful, God is going to send the final 7 last plagues. Now we know that the 10 plagues were here, but that's really what was going on, is the 7 last plagues are coming, right? Because, listen, I'm going to talk about it in the future too, but you have 10 plagues. The first 3 were upon everybody. The last 7 were only upon those who did not believe in the one true God, you see? So the 7 last plagues are what's in our future. And we will be affected by them, but not like the first 3 that were mentioned in Exodus chapters, I think it's 7 and onward. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, we'll wait for that to know exactly what chapter it is. But somewhere here in Exodus, you can see that the first 3 were upon everybody. The 7 last plagues were not upon everybody. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. Kind of like Jonah thinking that he could flee from the face of God. That doesn't work very well. Anyways, Pharaoh, he was not all-knowing. He wasn't divine. And so he wasn't able to find Moses. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh, and he dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. It's almost like he's taking a break. He's sitting down to get a cool something to drink. And what happens in verse 16? Now, this is a new paragraph. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. 7? That sounds interesting. 7 daughters. And they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their flocks with. And so this priest has daughters, and the priest's daughters are doing ministry. They're feeding and watering the flocks that God has given them, okay? And so you can see almost like the ministry of God here referred to in verse 16. Now, the shepherds came and drove them away. Well, these are the bad guys that are shepherds as well. So, not all shepherds are good shepherds. In fact, sometimes the shepherds, according to Jeremiah, will eat the sheep. And that's not a good idea. We're not going to kill and eat the sheep. We're supposed to, bring the sheep together so they can produce more sheep. And that's supposed to be what happens. But, there's good priests and there's bad priests. And so these priests, shepherds rather, not priests. I was thinking of this word here. There's good shepherds and there's bad shepherds. And the bad shepherds have chased the good shepherds away. But Moses, he's now, instead of a ruler in Egypt, one, by the way, who had been trained in warfare. He had been trained probably in more than one language. He had skills in leading large groups. He was very intelligent in all of the history of Egypt, the history of the nations around. He probably knew geography pretty well. He knew the lay of the land. I mean, he was going to be Pharaoh one day. You're not going to teach him just a few things like, reading, writing, and arithmetic. You're going to teach him all the stuff for him to be prepared for the leadership of a nation. And of course God could use this guy. That's why it was God's plan to take this child that was 12 years old from mama and bring her over into the land of Egypt so that he could be educated in all the ways that God would be able to use later when God used Moses to call a nation up out of Egypt. You see, oh, there you go. That was the providence. And so mama didn't understand. She was like totally upset with this idea that she's giving her child into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, but God had a bigger plan. God had a picture for this child, 12 years old, to raise him up with the education of the world so that he'd be able to lead God's people in the future. So it's brilliant. It's amazing. It's hard to understand all the ways that God works. Anyways, the bad shepherds come in, and now this guy who used to be a leader in Egypt, but now he's starting to be a shepherd, chasing off shepherds. He stood up and helped these fair young maidens, which were the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian, and watered their flock. Okay? So these 7 women, let's go and I'm going to see Isaiah chapter 4. This is just coming to my head. In that day, which is the day of judgment, according to chapters 2 and 3, in that day 7 women, they shall take hold of one man. So 7 women in that day will take hold of one man. Now that one man would be Christ in this scenario, if you're understanding this in a prophetic, symbolic sense. In that day 7 women will take hold of one man, saying, listen, we're going to eat our own bread. We don't want your health message. We're going to wear our own apparel. We don't want to dress like you want us to dress. Yet, only let us be called by your name to take away our reproach, right? So there's 7 women that are bad women. There's 7 women that are good women. These are the 7 daughters, right? Well, so that's kind of like an end time scenario there as well, if you wanted to run with that someday. So the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses, he stood up and helped those 7 good women and watered their flock. So now Moses is actually entering into the field of being a shepherd as well. For 40 years he was there as a shepherd. When they came to Reuel, which was their father, he said, "Wow, how is it that you are come so soon today?" And the 7 fair damsels, they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock as well." I mean, this guy's amazing. He took care of these evil shepherds, but he also watered our flock and us. I mean, like, we didn't go away thirsty either. Well, Reuel was like, "Well, wait a minute." He said unto his daughters, "Where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." Of course, if you're taking care of God's people, you will be provided for. In fact, your bread and your water will be what? Your bread and your water will be sure. Even though Moses is running away from a nation who is trying to take his life, a nation who wants him to go contrary to God's will, a nation who is leading people to be forced into something that they are consciously against, that nation is the one that God is protecting him from. And when you are being protected from that kind of nation, your bread and your water will be sure, right? Especially if you're trying to take care of God's people. You know, those 7 fair damsels, and you're watering the sheep. If you're trying to take care of God's people and you're trying to, help against the enemy, God will take care of you. Now, is it always easy? No. I mean, Moses, you think it was easy after he was running away from Pharaoh and then sat down for something to drink at the well? He was exhausted. Are you kidding me? He was running for his life. So no, it's not always easy, but it's going to be that you're taken care of. And if not, God is going to lay you to rest, and that's going to be a blessing because you're going to be able to sleep through all the trials that are in the future. So even going to sleep in Christ is not something that we should be worried about. I know sometimes it's tempting to be worried about that, but this is not something we need to worry about. Be faithful to God. That's what you need to be worried about. So let's understand a little bit more here. Moses was content. He was happy. Even in the midst of running for his life, even in the midst of becoming a shepherd when he used to be a prince, even when he had to chase off shepherds who were probably, cursing and swearing and angry and wanting to do harm to those fair young ladies, Moses was content. No matter what state I am in, Paul said, I have learned therewith to be content. So Moses here, even though he's not, a leader in Egypt anymore, he's not eating the same kind of foods that he had, he's not being, taken care of by servants, he's still content. He was content to dwell with the man. And as a result, Moses got Zipporah, the man's daughter, right? So one of those 7 ladies was the one that God had chosen. Almost like the 7 days, and there's one that God had chosen. That's kind of interesting. So there is a woman out of 7 that God chose for his people. There is a day out of 7 that God chose for his people. Right during the time that there is this whole, going against God nation, against God's people, and they want God's people to go against God's desires with them. There's, one of the daughters that's chosen out of the 7. One of the days that's chosen out of the 7. I think we could relate something there to the end time events as well with the seal of God and the mark of the beast. So she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom. Now Gershom, I don't remember what the name of that is, but I think it means stranger. She actually said, this is like I was saying earlier, when you have a name and then there's a statement after it, it actually means that name. I have been a stranger in a strange land. So, you call your son stranger. Well, why? Because this world is not our home, friends. The children that we bear, they are not to be part of this world. They are supposed to be part of another world. Like I had a pastor, actually it was the conference president when I was working in Michigan. He was at a minister's meeting and he stood up with fire in his eyes and he said, listen, we're at the end of time. We need to be raising our children to be martyrs. I was like, wow, because I had a son at that time, maybe a daughter as well. But I was just like, okay, this is for real now. And ever since then, I've just believed that that's part of our purpose. We're at the end of time, especially now. This is incredible. We are in the time of the end. I mean, the gates are closing pretty soon, and you're not going to have much time to get out of the cities. You're not going to have much time to prepare, because pretty soon this stuff's going to get real ugly real fast. And that's what was going on here with Moses. He's bearing this child, and he wants to raise him up as a stranger in a strange land. This is not your home. It came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. So there was a defeat, if you will, from that king that knew not Joseph. And I'm sure that, I don't know if that was the same one that died or not, but that lived rather. And the children of Israel sighed. Why? By reason of the bondage. So the children of Israel are still in the midst of this struggle. God is working. He's raising up Moses. He's raising up Moses' wife and Moses' child. And he's preparing God's people to deliver these Israelites that are still, by reason of bondage, sighing and crying because of the sins that are done in the land of Jerusalem, in the city. Like, that's what I'm talking about with Ezekiel chapter 9 there. So the Israelites are sighing and crying. And what happens in Ezekiel 9 when you have sighing and crying? It's these people that receive the mark in their forehead, and they're delivered from the slaughter. So these Israelites are doing exactly what God wants them to do. And why are they doing it? Because the Egyptians are treating them with bondage, or as though they are in bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. So listen, if you feel like you're an Israelite and you're sighing and crying, you are being heard. God is listening to you. God is doing something. Do never forget, God is not asleep. He is wide awake and willing to save. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And listen, if you are Christ's, you are part of that team. I'll show you in just a second here. It's Galatians chapter 4, and then I'm going to scroll up one verse. If you are Christ's, then are you Abraham's seed, which is child, and you are heirs according to the promise. What promise? The promise that God gave to Abraham, that his children will be as the stars of the sky, right? So if, not because, but if, so it's a conditional thing. If you are Christ's, so it's your choice. You can be Christ's or you cannot. You can be Christ's or you can be Antichrist's, whichever you choose. There are only two spirits in the world, that of Christ and that of Antichrist. But if you are Christ's and you have his spirit, then, and only then, are you children to Abraham. Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob became Israel, and you are therefore an Israelite. Okay, so that's what's happening here. God heard the groaning of his people by reason of their bondage, and God remembered his people and his covenant with his people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became Israel. And that's you if you are Christ's. God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Amazing. That's the end of the chapter, but I'm just saying, listen, I want God to look upon me, and I want God to have respect upon me. Why? Because I'm sighing and crying because of the sins that are done in Israel. I'm crying and sighing because of the sins of Egypt. I'm crying and sighing because of the sins of Babylon. I'm crying and sighing because of the sins of all the nations of the world today coming together to do what they can to fulfill Revelation 17, with all of them having one mind to make war against the Lamb. But those that are with the Lamb are called, chosen, and faithful. I want to be one of those. And I want God to have respect because of my desires to not be in bondage with the Egyptians, but to be delivered and given over to his service and his service alone. If that's your desire, then I want you to pray with me that we can yield our hearts over to God, and he can do with us as he wills, contrary to allowing us to be used of the state to do as they will. Let's pray together, asking for his blessings. Holy Father, I ask that you would please help us to surrender ourselves to you, that we can be directed by you, we can be led by you, we can be given instruction through your word, and we can follow the dictates of your conscience over the dictates of the nations around us who are desiring us to go contrary to your will. Even though we might lose our job, even though we might have to run, even though we might end up with children in a strange land, I pray that you would please help us to be faithful to you. Because we know from this story, if we're faithful to you, you are doing something for us. You will not leave us Alone, you will not leave us in the hands of the enemy without your Spirit encouraging and empowering us. And we know that even though sometimes it looks dark, even though we might be wearied by a well, trying to just get something to drink when the evil shepherds show up, we know that you have a plan. So please continue to guide us, and we thank you so much for all that you've given in Jesus' name. Amen.
Just a couple of things or a few different things were brought up earlier. We talk about draconian, we talk about prayer life, and then the story is very fitting to kind of parallel to what's going on in our day and age. And the other thing was about your son having this enlistment. And in this time and age, and of course, about the vaccine as well, but this time and age it takes a certain amount of faith. But I would like to endorse a book that really talks on these matters, because it talks to all of these matters, as a matter of fact. And it's a book about the life of Franz Hassel, A Thousand Shall Fall.
It's a good one.
I don't know if people are familiar with that book, but as a family, we've read that when my sons were young, probably before they actually had to sign a draft card as well. And I've had that conversation with them. And also when they were young adults here in the house, we read it. And I tell you what, that will definitely strengthen your faith, folks. And you talk about being in a situation where you don't want to be. This was a man, a little backstory is for some of those that don't understand or don't know about it. But Franz Hassel was a German. He was a Sabbath keeper, and he was enlisted into the army in World War II. But he was also a man that was very active, Seventh-day Adventist man that was very active in his church. And he was a praying, believing man. But they went through some hardships, and he found himself in situations where he didn't want to be. But yet he was there, almost kind of like Moses, in a situation where you want to be. But God directed his life. But he was faithful to God and all that he did. In fact, he was so faithful, he went against, he didn't believe in, of course, killing. And here he is, he ended up leading, troops and what have not. But he had someone make himself a fake gun, because as an officer of the German army, if you did not carry your sidearm, you could be shot. But he had somebody put a wooden gun there, and he said, God will preserve me. So anyhow, a sales pitch on that, very relevant to what we're talking about in the story. If somebody knows or can second that, very good. So that's all I wanted to say.
I second that. It's a good book. Now, there are some principles in the book that I think are a description of what happened rather than the prescription of what should happen. But, he just was telling the story as it reads. I mean, how difficult would it be to get everything right with that many years in a war? So, yeah, I get it.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. But the important thing is that he's a praying man, and
Right.
he asked for some wisdom. And the Lord put him in certain situations. But not only that, when he was separated from his family, he's praying on behalf of his family as well. And, his family's praying for him. So it's very encouraging nonetheless. And, of course, you have to use discretion when we read and stuff. But,
Amen. The name of the book is A Thousand Shall Fall. We have some people that we know. My wife and I have dear friends from years back when I was a pastor in Michigan. We knew a couple that actually put that book into audio format. And the woman, the book is read by her, and she does all the different voices, so she does a really good job. And then her husband put the music behind it. So some sound effects, but mostly just music to illustrate the intense portions of that, etc. So if you can find the audiobook of that, it's really good, really powerful. A Thousand Shall Fall.
Oh, that's cool.